Hi, thanks everyone for being here. Yvonne and I have worked pretty hard the past couple months. So it's really exciting to see so many of you here, and that's awesome. As one of the young people you guys are talking about, it's very exciting to be included on this discussion. And I have the honor of introducing Caroline today. Her talk is The Harms of Restrictive Gender Norms in the United States, and how important is that work given all the gender restriction bans that are seem to come, so often. Every month we're facing new restrictions on LGBTQ plus youth, and just how needed is her work now. So incredibly important. So I'll read a bit about her. She has quite an impressive um, pieces of work here. So Dr. Caroline is the executive director of the Representation Project and chair of the Critical Theory and Social Justice Department at the Occidental College in Los Angeles. Her research specializes in media, the presidency, and systems of power. She has 6 published books, including Protest Politics in the Marketplace, Consumer Activism in the Corporate Age, Women, Power, and Politics, The Fight for Gender Equality in the United States, and Madam President, Gender and Politics on the Road to the White House. She has been active in real-world politics as a professional pollster, campaign management, campaign manager, and commentator for CNN International and Spectrum One. She has also been featured in popular documentaries, Misrepresentation, The Mask You Live In, The Hunting Ground, Informant, Equal Means Equal, Liberated, Nevertheless, and The American Great Lie. So with that, I'm so excited to hear from you, Caroline, and yeah, take it away.
Thank you so much, Taylor. So I can't go anywhere without a PowerPoint. So what you'll probably want to do is pin me so you can see the PowerPoint. You just go up to the 3 little dots on the right-hand side and on my little box and pin. With that said, the PowerPoint, I can share it with anyone who would like the PowerPoint after the fact. And I'm going to be going rather quickly. So it's more of an impressionable PowerPoint because there's a lot of data. And this is a big part of our work, the data part of it. But I will be talking about the harms of restrictive gender norms in the United States. And as we jump in, let me tell you about the Representation Project. And my goal today is twofold. One is to share our work, and the second is to perhaps get you thinking about gender norms and stereotypes, gender justice, in some very concrete ways as they play out in the United States. We at the Representation Project believe that restrictive gender norms and stereotypes are a human rights issue, and we situate it within the long history of the establishment of human rights in different cultures over time. And we look at how it harms boys, girls, and gender nonconforming or gender expansive folks, right? And so what our argument is, or we'll make the case, I'll make the case today, that restrictive gender norms are a silent but very pervasive form of oppression in the United States that affect everyone in all the categories, regardless of what category you're in. The Representation Project was founded in 2011 by Jennifer Siebel Newsom. She is currently the first partner of California, but well before she and Gavin Newsom went to the state capitol, she was a filmmaker and continues to be a filmmaker focused on gender justice. And our organization has produced 4 films. The first is Misrepresentation, that focused on how media representations harm girls and women. Then The Mask You Live In, that came out in 2015, and it looks at the harms of restrictive masculinity on boys and men. Our third film, The Great American Lie, looks at the history of how sexism and racism intersectionally have prevented folks from achieving the American dream. And our latest film, called Fair Play, focuses on how gender inequality and the imbalance in the home has negative effects on the couple, on the children, on the family unit, and on society. We focus on how, specifically in that film, how the adoption of masculine ethics at a policy and a national level ends up harming a lot of folks. So we are focused on really going after restrictive gender norms and stereotypes. And so I want to start the presentation with a brief overview of how this fits into human rights. And I'll just say, I think it's really important as DEIJ or JDEIA programs are under attack in the United States, that we reframe all of this in terms of human rights, because it has less of it hasn't been made into a partisan issue yet. Human rights, when you say human rights, I think you're sitting at a table, a lot of people will be dedicated to that. They won't have been misinformed and miseducated about what it means. And so I think it's a really important place to, an important way semantically to make the same arguments that you might make with a DEIJ presentation, but rather using different language. Then I want to look at traditional gender roles just briefly, and then briefly provide data on the harm to girls, the harm to boys, the harm to gender expansive youth, and then some action steps. And I will say that our films have been viewed 28 million times, mostly the masculine and misrepresentation, which are our films aimed at youth. And our curriculum have been used, our film curriculum have been used by 2.3 million students in the United States and somewhat outside of the United States. And we do have a brand new curriculum called the Gender Equity Training Curriculum that focuses, it's 8 modules, free for parents, for educators, which we assume will be the biggest market, that teachers will want to use it in their classroom, and also peer-to-peer. And all of that will be available July 15th. So hopefully, if this presentation resonates with you, that you'll want to adopt our free gender equity training curriculum. So human rights, what are they? And it seems strange to be at a human rights conference defining human rights, but I like to start at a place, right, of thinking about the fact that these are socially constructed, right? Human rights constitute a set of norms governing the treatment of individuals and groups by state and non-state actors. In other words, they're rules that human beings made up. And I think that when especially young people, we tend to think of laws and practices as kind of set in stone, and they came from, they natural in some way, but they're not at all natural. They're just the rules that human beings today have decided to make up about how, in particular with human rights, how individuals are going to be treated, how groups are going to be treated by the state and non-state actors. I know on this slide I've broken every norm of slides, but I think it's an important one, right? To look at to situate the current struggles for social justice and inclusion in the long history of the struggle for human rights. Humans have been at this for a very, very long time. Even in ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China, folks were actively thinking and establishing norms around how human beings should be treated. So those are the early seeds of human rights. And of course, we see Plato and Aristotle in ancient Greece and Rome, especially in Rome, laws actually implemented based upon these theories that have been percolating for centuries about how individuals and groups should be treated vis-a-vis the state and other individuals and non-state actors. And then in 1215, we see the signing of the Magna Carta, which establishes that the monarch and nobility actually have certain ground rules. So we see the establishment of individual liberties, meaning freedom from the monarchy intervening and doing whatever they want willy-nilly. So the first real kind of line drawn between what people in the noble class and everyday citizens, what they could do to everyday citizens. And then, of course, the Enlightenment, a couple of centuries of really actively thinking about this and having public discourse around this, reminiscent of classical antiquity back in Rome and Greece. There was a lot of public conversation. We see this again for 2 centuries. And of course, I'm not doing these periods justice, but it gives you a general sense of how long humans have been at this. And then in France, the French Revolution gives rise to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, that the language here would would be echoed across the globe, especially in the United States, or what would become the United States in 1789, right, where actually just be our Constitution is adopted. And those, so all of the same ideas that are percolating with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, also we hear echoes of that in our Declaration and certainly in our Constitution. And then the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the most important document we have for how we practice and think about human rights today, that enshrine a comprehensive set of rights. And it is an aspirational document, but boy, does it tell you where we should be. So how does gender tie into this? Well, we tend to think of human rights as being direct violations, either of somebody's bodily integrity in the form you might think of domestic violence or sexual violence. And those are absolutely violations of human rights that are gender-based. But I want to expand our way of thinking about human rights and gender beyond the obvious. I do think those are obvious. Beyond the obvious, to the idea that in the history of human rights, has been, especially in the modern age, has been a history of expanding how we think of it to, for example, economic rights are now pretty widely considered to be a part of human rights, whereas they weren't, a couple centuries ago. I would like to think about the freedom, especially for children, right? The freedom to be who they are. Without undue constraint and restraint from adults as a part of human rights. And that's where traditional gender roles come into play. Because what ends up happening is, because we have such restrictive traditional gender roles, we end up very much constraining what young people can choose to be. And I'm going to provide plenty of evidence for this. And I'm going to link it to depression. I'm going to link it to death by suicide. I'm going to link it to some really severe outcomes, to eating disorders, for example. And so I know on the left, there's a lot of oppression Olympics, and I don't want to engage in that, but I will say that the everyday insidious ways in which gender norms and stereotypes and traditional gender roles really restrict and harm everyone is something that is mostly gone unnoticed. I'll tell you the source of all of the data. So this is a Gallup poll, right? And it was taken last year. What do we value most in terms of men and women? Well, I will say we still have very traditional gender roles, in the sense that the things that you might imagine, what do we think of when we think about valuing men? We value them for their prestige and their financial success. I'm glad to see that 1 in 3 Americans also value men for honesty and morality, which are traits, but in terms of what they actually do, it's professional financial success, ambition, and leadership, and then being tough and having strength and working hard. And for women, it's physical attractiveness, and then it's nurturing, right? So the top, if you look at those numbers, it is very clear that we think about men and women in very gendered ways. And in fact, if we dig down a little bit more deeply, we see, and this is again Gallup data, very large gaps in the types of pressure that men and women face, right? So we get the message of what we're supposed to be. Men primarily face pressure for supporting their families financially and being successful in their careers, and women primarily get a pressure for being a good parent and being physically attractive. In terms of traditional gender roles and their harms to girls, the number one thing, and I'll just back up for a moment, the number one thing that the role and expectation that we have, if you looked at those Gallup polls, is to be attractive, specifically to be sexy, right? So being sexual means that it is about us, and that's our sexual pleasure, right? But being sexy means that you're being sexy for others. You're being attractive, appealing for others, which I argue that when we think about this, we have this dichotomy at play here, right? Which is the subject-object dichotomy. And when we think about sexuality and what girls and women are supposed to be, sexual subjects act and sexual objects are acted upon. So men are encouraged to be sexual subjects, and women are encouraged to be valuable, highly attractive sexual objects, which means they're always being acted upon, right? They're always in a subordinate position, regardless of whether or not they are an attractive or valuable object. They're always being acted on by sexual subjects because they are reduced to objects that are acted upon. So what does that mean? Well, sexual objectification is the act of treating a person solely as an object of sexual desire. It literally means moving somebody from the category of personhood to the category of an object. And how does this tie into human rights in the more obvious ways that we think about it? Well, the dehumanizing a group is the first step in enacting violence against that group, right? So it is not surprising that because we live in an objectification culture where girls and women are compelled and supposed to be sex objects, mostly because we have a patriarchal capitalist system, that makes billions of dollars off of our body dissatisfaction. But because we are defined in that way, we are en masse dehumanized, and there's some variation there. Obviously, women of color are going to be intersectionally dehumanized in very specific ways that are more extreme than white women. But all women are dehumanized through sexual objectification because that is considered a constitutive part of who we are. And therefore, it is not surprising that 1 in 2 women will face some form of sexual violence in her lifetime, that Latin and Black women and Native women will face much higher rates of sexual violence than white women, because intersectionally, we are facing incredibly high rates of dehumanization. That's what's at the core of sexual violence. Domestic violence data looks very similar. So how do we know we live in an objectification culture? Well, I like to look at media. Media is a barometer for our cultural values. It both reflects and shapes, which makes it a kind of a double-edged sword, right? It can open up this space for imagination to have and create worlds that we want to live in. For example, it creates worlds where transgender and gender expansive folks can live lives, and somebody in middle America who may not be exposed to that can actually see someone living a life and being humanized that doesn't look like them. But what do we see in terms of objectification culture, the negative side of it? In children's TV shows, women characters are 6 times more likely to be sexually objectified, and they're just as likely to be sex objects in rated G as rated R movies. It is no surprise then that starring Ferguson find that over half of 6-year-old girls say they want to be sexy by the time they're 6. They may not quite know what that is, but they know they want to be it. So what's the issue here? Why is this a human rights issue? Well, we know that if you have experiences of sexual objectification, you end up engaging in body surveillance. In other words, you internalize this idea that you're supposed to be a sex object, and you are constantly thinking about your body. And what does this lead to? Research has linked it to greater body shame, anxiety, reduced flow experiences. So it literally reduces your cognitive flow. So for example, there's a great article on this from Diamond that talks about how throwing like a girl. So if you, the ability to throw a ball is reduced if you are thinking of yourself as a sex object, because your cognitive load is taken off somewhere else, right? And so in an experimental setting, they put teen girls throwing balls in different circumstances. And the circumstance in which they were sexually objectified, they were less able to throw the ball with accuracy and speed. We also see the same thing with math tests. So if you trigger objectification in girls, they perform more poorly in academic work. So you can see how this has real world consequences that we don't tend to think about. And ultimately, it leads to eating disorders, depression, and sexual dysfunction. So at the heart of a lot of, I would argue, the human rights compromise of being a girl in our culture is objectification culture. I'm just going to quickly run through all of these studies. I just truncated them into one list. So self-objectification, which means the more you see yourself as a sex object, because the world has told you that that's what you are, the more you will hate your body, deprioritize your own sexual pleasure and the pleasure of your partners. You will put that over your own. Risk health with cosmetic procedures. You will more likely to be depressed, engage in habitual body monitoring, which is constantly thinking about your body in ways that disrupt your pleasure, for example, during sex. Have eating disorders, try to control your weight with cigarettes, have shame about natural body function, slower brain functioning, and poorer motor skills, which I just talked about, experience sexual dysfunction. More likely you will be to compete with other women for attention. So it actually harms your female relationships, socially erasing older women, right? So if your value in a culture is that you're a valuable sex object, and then you age out of that. Everybody ages out of that. So the system is absolutely rigged for older women having value. You'll also have lower self-confidence, political activism, social activism, and be concerned about issues in the world. I want to dive more deeply into a couple of these to show you why this is a human rights issue and one that we need to address. 3 in 4 women have disordered eating in the US. 15% of teen girls have a diagnosable eating disorder. The number is probably much higher, but that is the actual number who have been diagnosed. And this affects their normal everyday activities. About 70% say they avoid activities when they're not feeling good about their bodies, including going to school. Girls who read fashion magazines, 12 times more likely to develop eating disorders. And a teen girl who consumes social media is at a much higher risk for an eating disorder. So we actually have, what does this mean? It means we have to actually interrogate the fact that we have beta tested, the adults have beta tested these smartphones on now 2 generations, Gen Z and Gen Alpha. We beta tested a technology on them that is delivering them images, which are going to increase their risk of depression and eating disorders and anxiety. And now we're starting to see this data. And of course, these are Gen Z is the most depressed group that we have seen on the planet since we've been measuring this. And of course, depression and anxiety, direct results of the content. It's not just the time away and the lack of sleep, it's also the content of what they're seeing, which is rewiring their brains. So girls' exposure to thin ideal media is associated with significantly higher rates of anxiety and depression. Depression is a primary driver of suicidal ideation and attempts for teen girls. We see some similar data for teen boys, but not as the significance is not as extreme. Body dissatisfaction and depression linked to social media. Instagram, we know from Meta's leaked report, their own data. Instagram makes teen girls feel worse about their bodies almost immediately upon consuming it. And digital media is linked to higher rates of depression and suicidal ideation for teens. Jeannie Twinch's research that came out a few years ago. We also know that that girls who hold rigid gender roles do not thrive as much. So for example, we know that 5-year-olds, that's about the age where we start to see these ideas that about gender roles and occupations. So boys should go into these jobs and girls should go into these jobs. The gender stereotypes limit choices for everyone, but especially girls. Girls feel, we know in follow-up studies, are more rigid in their life path because of these gender roles, which just close, they make the world much smaller for both boys, girls, and gender expansive youth. We know that teen girls who embrace traditional gender roles are more vulnerable to depression and have higher rates of depression. And another study answers the why, that the negative cognition beliefs like hopelessness. So being raised in a household with rigid gender roles causes you to be less hopeful or causes you to be more hopeless about being able to choose your future. And that causes higher rates of depression in teen girls. We also know that that makes teen girls more likely to experience dating violence. And that's probably because they're in relationships, probably in heterosexual relationships, if it's ideologically rigid, based in religion, and they're going to be with teen boys who hold those more rigid gender beliefs, who are more likely to perpetrate dating violence. I want to talk now about how traditional gender roles harm boys. You may have heard of the man box. I'm not going to read all of this, and again, I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with anyone who would like it. But the man box refers to a set of beliefs communicated by parents, family, and media and peers and other socializing agents that put pressure on boys and men to act certain ways, right? They're supposed to be self-sufficient, tough, physically attractive, stick to rigid gender roles, be heterosexual, demonstrate sexual prowess, etc. So let's break down the man box. What does it mean? Well, there are 7 primary traits or expectations that boys are supposed to comply with. And if they don't comply with this, they are policed by their peers. So this is from an excellent study from Equimundo called the man box. First, they're supposed to be self-sufficient, not talk about their worries or fears or get any mental health assistance. They're supposed to act tough and use their physical strength to manage and control situations. They're supposed to be physically attractive, have very rigid masculine gender roles, right? They're not supposed to cook, sew, clean the house, do household chores. They're also they're supposed to be compulsory heterosexual, and they're supposed to be homophobic, right? That they're supposed to be homophobic and transphobic in order to perform their heterosexuality. They're supposed to be hypersexual and have as many conquests as possible in order to be a real man, and aggressive and use control, violence if necessary to get respect. So the interesting thing is I'm telling you about the man box, but you already know about it, because what happens with gender norms is that they're in the water. Everyone knows what they are without speaking about it. This is a slide with a lot of data. But from the Equimundo study, we know the percentage, the extent to which young men, teen boys and young men in the United States, right? So 18 to 24-year-olds buy into these ideas. And you can see very high rates of men buying into this idea that this is who they're supposed to be. For example, pillar 2, acting tough. 68% of young men say a guy who doesn't fight back when others push him around is weak. 75% say guys should act strong even if they feel scared or nervous inside. 52% say it's not good for a boy to be taught to cook, sew, clean the house, take care of younger children. 58% say straight guys being friends with gay guys is totally fine and normal and a positive statement, which is an improvement over a decade ago. But then 55% say a gay guy is not a real man, right? So still a dehumanization, a dismissal of gay men in your lives. 60% say a real man should have as many sexual partners as he can, and 63% say a real man would never say no to sex, which is disturbing in terms of consent. So you can see relatively high buy-in for all of these pillars of the man box. Also, these young men are reporting in the US very high rates of depressive symptoms. So 1 in 2 suicidal thoughts or ideation, 56%. 81% report that they perpetrated bullying, and 87% have experienced bullying, because this is how the man box works. Young men are policing themselves. They're not the only social policers here, but they're a primary source. 71% have experienced sexual harassment, and when you ask them who they've experienced it from, it's mostly from their male peers. And then 27% are engaging in binge drinking. Traditional masculinity is a killer for boys and men. Men die at higher rates at every age than women, and their life expectancy is lower than women. So let's unpack this. So young men with high traditional masculinity, meaning when we measure it, they very much believe in traditional gender roles, are significantly more likely to die by suicide than non-HTM men. So men who do not have high traditional masculinity. And if you jump down to the last bullet point, you can see why this is the case. There's a gun link here that young men with high traditional masculinity, teens, have more access to firearms. Death by suicide rates are 3.2 times higher for teenage boys than girls, with guns playing a role in 90% of these deaths. High HTM men, so men with high traditional masculinity, also engage in more high-risk behaviors, such as driving fast, smoking, binge drinking, etc. And they die 7 years sooner than their non-HTM peers, which should be shocking data. Just came out, 2023. Why aren't we having a national conversation about this? That the way in which we've constructed the box of masculinity for boys and young men literally sets them up for an early death. And in fact, men in their early 20s are 3 times more likely than women in their 20s to die of high-risk behaviors, and they're far less likely to seek mental health. I didn't put the data up for physical health, but men, whether they have a physical ailment or a mental health challenge, are less likely to seek the treatment that they need. There are also harms, significant harms to gender expansive youth. And I want to share some data from the Human Rights Campaign, a gender expansive survey, a nationally representative gender expansive survey in the United States, the first of its kind, 2/3 of which folks identified as other and 1/3 identified as transgender. We know that only 4% of gender expansive youth report being very happy, right? Which is a significant gap between gender expansive youth and other young people. So if you look at the percentage that the straight cisgender male youth are the happiest. So you can, this chart right here shows you what is happening with gender as a human rights issue, right? How is it that gender is determinative, our place, the bodies we're born into, and then how we're performing our gender, that is determinative so significantly of our happiness. I would also like to point out, these numbers are all low. This is the result of, not just, but a primary driver of this is a result of beta testing smartphones on young people. And so we see rates of unhappiness across the board, high rates of unhappiness across the board. We also know in terms of gender expansive youth that only 43% of gender expansive youth have someone they can talk to and inside their family, and 59% outside. So they don't have the support system. A majority of them do not have a support system inside their family, and a sizable number don't even have it outside the family. It is no surprise then that gender expansive youth are much less likely to report definitely fitting in their community. Only 5%, right? And 30% say they don't fit in. Why is this a human rights issue? Imagine being born into the world, into a body with your sense of gender identity, meaning that you don't fit in your home, in your community, in your school space. It's such an alienating experience for so many young people. That idea of not being a part of essentially of the human race in some fundamental ways, right? You learn early on that you're not fitting in the same way. Home and family acceptance. 27% report that their families are very accepting of LGBT folks. 36% say somewhat accepting, but you can see a very high number, persistent, very high number of folks in the home still not accepting LGBTQ plus folks. 30%, only 30% say that they have peer acceptance at school. The real number here is the 70% who don't feel that they have peer acceptance at school. And then in terms of inclusion and harassment, 40% of gender expansive youth are excluded frequently or often by their peers, excluded in their setting because of their gender, in their educational setting where they spend most of their time in their younger years, right? Most of their time, they're simply not accepted. 42% are frequently or often called names involving anti-gay slurs, and 37% are bullied and harassed. So action steps, so much we can do, right? I'll start at the bottom, sharing curriculum and films on gender justice with people in your life. And I want to spend the rest of the time taking this PowerPoint off and talking about the programs we offer, and perhaps others have programs too that address this. But protecting and supporting children of all genders, listening to the children. I've been a professor for a really long time, and the only way I stay on top of what is happening, because gender is a social construct, gender, sex, and sexuality are all social constructs. And I know that's a controversial statement. I teach courses on this, and it's always this kind of mind-blowing experience when students realize, and I realize how much human beings have just decided these are the rules of sex, these are the rules of gender, these are the rules of sexuality. But because they shift so rapidly over time and they vary by country to country, they are social constructs. So we do need to listen to the young people who are making their way in the world, because they're going to have very different conceptions of gender, sex, and sexuality than previous generations. And of course, it's not going to be homogenous. There's going to be incredible diversity in both how they're thinking of the link between sex and gender and their gender expression. Actively rejecting traditional roles and expectations will immediately improve the mental health of the children in your life. Also, I would say abolish the gender binary, the sex gender binary. I don't think that gender is, I don't think the sex gender binary is a meritorious way for organizing the world. I don't think it's a useful way for organizing our social categories, our employment categories, social, political, and economic lives. I don't think it has actually ever been a useful tool for organizing our world. And so given its damage, I would really love to see it abolished. But I know that's kind of a radical position, but it's one I think we need to take if we really want to advance human rights. And I will end it there and then open it up to any to questions you may have about our programs, our approach to gender justice, or our approach to human rights. Thank you. We have a question. Matthew, thank you, Caroline, for this important and needed presentation. I surely would like to share this with several of my colleagues and neighbors. As a school board member in rural Maine, I've been experiencing book bans, assaults on gender expansive youth, and the growth of hate language against those involved with gender issues. The question is, do you think the combination of gender studies and human rights at the middle and high school levels might help dispel myths about gender issues? If yes, would you support an initiative for this type of curriculum to be a part of Common Core or other nationalized educational initiatives? Also, would you support USA teacher education programs, including a module on HRE gender studies and how to provide teaching and learning based on facts and not emotion? Absolutely, Matthew. So here's the interesting thing about, so I talked about the language early on, and I was listening to Sandra's presentation on human rights. And I'm thinking, I would keep gender out of it. I would Trojan horse it. Because, not to say that gender wouldn't be a part of the curriculum. I would frame it as human rights. And I say this because I'm giving talks to different teachers associations in red states that are experiencing this, right? So how do you talk about DEI without talking about DEI? Well, you anchor it in human rights. Human rights, as I had mentioned or at the start of the presentation, everybody can agree on that. Nobody is going to be against human rights. And if they are, maybe they're a bad person, right? Because it's got such a good brand, if you will. And so the interesting thing is I made an exception today. I'm talking about gender norms and stereotypes and rigid, traditional gender roles. But I never talk about just gender alone. So not only would I anchor it in human rights, I would talk about it in terms of, we focus on actually 6 categories and their intersections. We focus on race, gender, ability, body size, age, and sexuality. And I find that the least controversial kind of categories of power and oppression are age and disability. So what I'd like to do is present a human rights base, a frame for a talk, go in, start with disability. Everybody can agree. We don't want to mistreat disabled individuals, which are 26% of the population when you look at it in terms of mental health, communication, cognitive, and physical disabilities. And then I go to age. And I talk about the fact that everybody is going to age if you're lucky, and what it means to treat people with dignity and respect throughout their life course. And then I jump into some of the more controversial politicized categories. Then I would get into gender. Then I would get into race. Then I would get into sexuality, because they're already thinking about it in a human rights lens. They've already thought about it in non-politicized ways. So when you extend it to categories that have become politicized, it becomes kind of ludicrous that we're not talking about it. So that's strategically how I would do it. But I absolutely think we get around the DEI attacks by framing it as a human rights issue. And Sandra, I don't know if you want to jump in here too. You're doing so much of this work. Oh, can you unmute?
I totally agree with what you pointed out. And in fact, as I listened to you, I'm trying to figure out now how we can post about this issue in a broader way, or how to raise it up, but I think it is vital to be able to point out, even, connecting it with which articles relate to us being human, as to who we are, and how to open that up for especially young people to really think about these issues. So yes, I just totally agree. And I do want to follow up with how we can do something even in our posting, and commenting about how to get this into a much more understood issue to face. I think about all these high schoolers I've seen and what they're going through, and this brings a whole spotlight on this issue.
Mhm. And I would also just maybe a non sequitur from that, there are young people right now, gender expansive, gender nonconforming youth who need immediate intervention. So beyond curriculum, would love to see like a team of folks who will go into a community and embrace the family and like what could we have done to prevent Nex's death, right? I don't know how to address that exactly, except I know that there's just an urgent need and it needs to be national and there needs to be action around it, like physically people showing up to support youth who are being harassed and bullied.
Just a quick thing about that is I do wonder, how to educate educators. Because what I've seen in like the high school, when the young women brought up the fact that they were humiliated by teachers when they had to go to the bathroom because they had their period, I was shocked to hear this in this time. So I'm thinking if this is going on with regard to what should have been a kind of a well-known issue, what is going on with teachers and how to bring this to their attention in teacher education about the issue of gender, that how to make that happen.
Maybe a student bill of rights, a national student bill of rights of what needs to happen in a classroom for it to be an inclusive, just, fair, humanizing space.
Yeah, I think it's a really good idea.
So for our curriculum, what we're imagining is in the redder states that aren't going to, that have bans on DEIJ, the way you get around this is by giving tools to students, because they can ban what teachers are doing. But they can't actually ban what students, they can ban formal clubs, but they can't ban informal gatherings, right? And so our curriculum focuses on healthy masculinities, on dating and sexual violence. It focuses, Trojan Horse focuses on gender expansive youth and inclusion. And by Trojan Horse, what that means is it's not in the title of the module that someone might see, but it is throughout the curriculum, right? The humanization of people of all genders, and students can download it, they can bring it, they can engage the content themselves, they can bring it into their school as part of a club. And so we are really focused on the peer-to-peer aspect of it, with the idea that young people will be saving themselves essentially.
I think oh, go Rocky.
Rocky, we can't hear you.
Yeah,
Oh, there you are.
yeah. No, I couldn't find my unmute button. Very informative and useful presentation. I've been sort of thinking about the slide we had, the action steps actively reject traditional gender roles and expectations, and the next one, abolish gender binary. And I was thinking about the slide you had, one of the earlier ones, of what was it, desirable traits of males and females. And I was wondering, and maybe this is something that's already in your curriculum, but starting off having kids, people, adults, label those as people. What are the desirable traits for humans? And then shift over to what we the data, and say, well, why is it different, and how did that happen, and what role do you have? I mean, is that kind of what you do in your curriculum?
Absolutely. So very, very similar exercise where we ask for your ideal human being, right? And what those traits would be. So it's a slightly different take, Rocky, in the sense that what ends up happening is people will idealize a white man and then they will describe the traits they associate with him. And then we have them look at traits for men and women and gender non-conforming folks, right? So depending upon how long they have for the exercise, but then we reveal the fact that they have centered a heterosexual white man as the ideal citizen. So it has a similar effect, but maybe, yes, it's quite shocking, right? That even the most, I mean, folks who are going to be doing this curriculum are probably they're ahead of the curve. And it still doesn't matter because gender norms and roles are so ingrained. And then at the end of that module, we end up talking about ideal universal human traits that we should all be embracing. And there are quite a few from men on there, right? There are quite a few that we associate with men. So being a hero, being of service to others, helping in situations of crisis and distress. So we're not, you notice I didn't use the term toxic masculinity, and we're not impugning boys and men. Our work is a love letter to boys and men, right? But also we want to elevate really positive traits of masculinity. I mean, the fact that women aren't allowed to be heroes, that doesn't mean that we should be impugning men because they are heroes. We should just be making that a universal trait.
Thanks. Makes sense.
Thank you. Oh, and any ideas you have for curriculum? We do have a number of those exercises, but always love to hear from educators who've worked in this space. Alana, do you have, yep.
Hi. Oh, I'm muting. Hi, Caroline. I founded and run a human rights education organization, Generation Human Rights. And I'm just, if you mentioned this before, I apologize. It went over my head. Is this high school that you focus on, or what age group is this, or is it elementary and middle as well?
It is aimed 7th through 24 or through college.
Great. So if you're interested, we can have a separate conversation, and I could tell you how we bring our human rights curriculum into red states across
Yes.
the US. It's a little tricky, but I will tell you my personal experience of how we've gotten it into these classrooms. So we could do that. I'll put my email, my contact information into the chat.
Wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I just have a quick question or a comment, even for all this work, is I think that we concentrate on how to bring these ideas into schools. And I'm wondering how we can think about bringing these curricula to other community centers and forums, because I think the greater population needs to know this. I mean, I've had people say to me, well, I'm glad you're teaching about the UDHR in schools. And I said, well, actually, I feel like it's important for you and your friends to know about this. And I just feel like there's a challenge of how to get this out into broader forums of our communities, to teach the general public about these issues. So I don't have an answer, but I think that it would be important.
We have had success with documentary films, with partnering community screenings. I mean, the way that we got up to 28 million screenings is primarily through, I mean, some of it's through, Netflix and Hulu, but quite a bit of it too is through the Boys and Girls Club doing a screening, your local Elks Club, somebody somewhere organizing. I find documentaries to be such a powerful tool to shift things, whether it's Blackfish, right? Shifting our conceptions of what SeaWorld should be doing, or Gasland, shifting our conceptions about fracking, or misrepresentation, shifting our conceptions about what should be in media, the sexism in media. It feels like, Sandra, if there was an actual documentary about it that engaged young people, it would have way more of an effect than a teacher sitting in a classroom. Not to diminish that at all, but boy, meeting them where they are.
Good point.
The power of storytelling, it really is something.
Well, I will say that I want to incorporate your curriculum, as best I can and promote it because it's so important. And it's free. And so all of these wonderful resources exist. And so here we have a group of change agents who are working in the trenches, to try to make things happen and other people don't know about it. So part of our job is to let other people know about these resources so that they can't say, well, I didn't know. Right. So that is something that I would love to talk to you more about, among many other things, right? This notion of women being objects that you've talked about, certainly males are objects too, in a different kind of way. And as it puts it into a bigger category for me, children are objects. And so that here you've got the objectification on multiple levels that's occurring. And so this is why I think that girls are at a particular disadvantage. So I appreciated your commentary, particularly about body surveillance. Last year we had Lindsay and Lexi talk about their book on gender and body beauty, and about how girls are forced to be beautiful. We have there's an international human rights in sport organization, and they talk about shrink it and pink it, with respect to women's clothes, so we're doing a little research on that. But this whole issue of body surveillance, we watch all the time how we look. I bet that every woman on this meeting today probably looked at themselves, looked at what they were wearing, looked at their makeup, got to have the right Zoom makeup, and so on. And so here we are surveilling ourselves all the time. And it's a real issue, right? I appreciated especially your term of looking at gender expansiveness. That's so positive, as opposed to more negative spin on it. Lovely term, that I think that we could all pick up and put into our vocabulary. One quick question, not that the answer will be quick. I know that there are many people now who are talking about how all children today are becoming more fluid and expansive with their gender. And what are parents doing today that's making that happen? And so they're blaming parents, right? Instead of looking at the fact that people have always existed, they just didn't talk about it. So can you briefly address what do you say to someone who is talking about, well, parents today, they're letting their little boys wear tutus, or, so on and so forth? Because I hear this all the time from folks.
Yeah, I was just at a comedy show where I was put on the spot with a really transphobic joke, and a comedian asked me about it, and I had a whole lot to say, called on the wrong person. So they're not getting this from their parents. They're not getting it from teachers. They are getting it from each other. They're getting it from social media. We can trace the rise of gender expansive identification to the widespread adoption of social media tools in 2012. It is plain as day. So my thoughts on it are, and more research needs to be done, but my thoughts on it are that gender is a social construct. So if you go to a menu and you see two things on that menu, you're going to order one of those two things. But if you have a menu and you have 63 gender categories like Facebook does, then you're going to maybe not order the two things that everybody has been ordering. So it's simply an expansion of the menu, because if gender is a social construct, which it is, I would again add to that, it's not just the ways we think of gender. Even sex is not something that nature recognizes as being two categories. So gender, sex, and then of course sexuality that is anchored to that binary in order for it to make sense. All of these are socially constructed to a greater or lesser extent. Young people are just way ahead of the rest of us. Young people have caught up with theorists from 40 years ago in the academy. Young people have figured out that there are a lot more options here. And so how do they know about the menu? They don't know about it from their parents. Their parents aren't telling them there are 63 gender categories. Their teachers aren't telling them that. Their teachers don't know. They are finding out about it through social media. And so this idea, the use of the term groomer, the idea that parents, and this is a language that comes up a lot, that parents are grooming their children. For what? what does it mean for a parent? So grooming is what pedophiles do to take advantage, to violate children. Parents, what are they, how is that language even being used with parents? And of course, it's just a way to make it dirty and bad and deviant and awful and criminal. Just being your own gender expression. So it's nonsensical to say that parents are grooming their kids, but also that's not where it's coming from. Kids are educating their parents. Kids are sharing the menu with their parents. They are sharing it with their teachers. They're sharing it with their professors. Every time I go into the classroom and teach a class on gender, sex, and sexuality, I am getting an education because it has changed in the past 3 months. Something has happened on social media. There is a new category. There's a new way of thinking about it. It changes rapidly because it's not set in nature and biology and some, entrenched thing. So yeah, my response is, that it's a bigger menu. Parents don't know the menu, so how could they be the ones driving it? Teachers don't know the menu. Anyone over the age of 26 doesn't know the menu, so they're not driving it. You have to look internally that kids are doing this, and so and then it begs the bigger question of how we should be responding to this, right? I mean, since the beginning of time, young people have been experimenting with gender identity and sexuality. And so they're just doing it in different ways. We did it in different ways than our parents did it. And so they're doing it in different ways than we have. So normalizing that they're just doing their typical teenage explorations in different ways now that they have social media.